brought two books for you to sign, one for me and Claire, and one for Jerry.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay, let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for your patience. I'm Anthony Carpy, Vice Provost and Dean of Research here at the college, and it's a pleasure to welcome you today to today's book talk with Professor Gloria Browne-Marshall as we celebrate her new work, A Protest History of the United States. Professor Browne-Marshall's book is a rigorous examination of how protests have shaped American society from its earliest days to the present. She traces 5 centuries of resistance from indigenous struggles against colonization to movements for civil rights, labor, gender, and climate justice. Through her research and clear analysis, she shows that protests are a defining feature of our history. Professor Browne-Marshall has brought her scholarship to audiences across more than 20 states and through numerous media engagements. She's used these platforms to connect historical understanding with current events, modeling how research can inform public dialogue and civic life. And it's a work that engages deeply with historical documents, legal records, and personal narratives to amplify voices that have too often been overlooked. So I'm so happy that the college can host this book talk today. Let me say a quick word about Professor Gloria Browne-Marshall. Gloria Browne-Marshall is a professor of constitutional law in the Department of Law and Police Science, an Emmy Award-winning writer, and a legal commentator. She has litigated cases for the NAACP, Legal Defense Fund, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and Community Legal Services. Her previous works include She Took Justice, The Black Woman, Law and Power, and The Voting Rights War. She is also a playwright and filmmaker, and her documentary film, Before 1619, She Took Justice, received the Jury Award at the Pan-African Film Festival in Cannes, among other awards. She also produced WHYY's Your Democracy, an animated series about the US Constitution, and is a frequent commentator on CNN, NPR, and MSNBC. I'm also pleased that joining Professor Browne-Marshall as a discussant is John Jay's own Distinguished Professor Emerita of History and Women's Studies, Dr. Blanche Wiesen Cook. Nice to have you back, Blanche. Dr. Wiesen Cook's definitive 3-volume biography of Eleanor Roosevelt was called Monumental and Inspirational, a Grand Biography by the New York Times Book Review. All 3 volumes were New York Times bestsellers and received numerous awards, including the 1992 Biography Prize from the LA Times and the Lambda Literary Prize. And her other books include the Declassified Eisenhower and Crystal Eastman on Women and Revolution. So finally, let me thank Remy Bahati, Dan Stageman, the Office of Research Advisory Committee, and others in my office for making this happen. Thank you guys so much. I'm so pleased to be hosting this talk. I'm so pleased to be hosting this talk with 2 of our amazing faculty. So please join me in welcoming Professor Gloria Browne-Marshall and Dr. Blanche Wiesen Cook for our 3rd and final OAR book talk of the fall 2025.
Good evening. Thank you so much for coming out. And for those of you who don't know, protest rights are within our Constitution in the First Amendment. We have the right to free speech, as you know, the right to peaceable assembly, but we also have the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. To petition is to ask the government to redress is to fix or remedy. A grievance is a complaint. So the last line of the First Amendment of our U.S. Constitution says we have the right to ask the government to fix our complaints. So what I want us to know about the protest history of the United States, we're going to talk about, but I also want to just read a couple of excerpts from my book. My first protest outside of my family was in the 3rd grade. I marched through the streets with classmates, carrying signs demanding that the adults vote to pass a tax levy to finance public school renovations. We laughed, sang a protest song I had written, and watched the sunset, feeling ourselves champions of a cause we believed all adults would be foolish to ignore. The measure failed miserably. Here's another section from the book. The United States of America is made better when her people demand better. Using the ideals of the U.S. Constitution as a lantern, small groups and national organizations have often cobbled together a vision of freedom beyond the status quo and then set out into the streets to make it a reality. The protesters who make up a movement's vanguard bear the greatest weight and may fail miserably, but they are driven and are especially blessed for the sacrifices that make it a less difficult future for others. One needs to learn about the protests that secured the liberties enjoyed daily, even as the nation fails to recognize the price paid to gain them. Now we'll have a conversation. Come on over here.
First of all, let me just say, am I on?
Yeah.
This is a splendid book. It is so powerful and so lyrically written, and it is really also a combination of memoir, family history, and U.S. history, and constitutional history, and political responses. So, question. You start with let me back up. For many years here at John Jay, 55 years, I taught at John Jay. I taught a course called Violence and Social Change because I was going to write a book about violence against the indigenous people, against the slave people, against the labor unions and the working people. And I was going to write this book. Only you wrote it so beautifully and powerfully, and it's fabulous. So, question, how did you decide to write it? And second question, how did you decide and what did you learn when you started with the indigenous people?
Well, I'll say one thing to back up. I hope that during your time period, whether or not in school, and I see some of my students, former students, whether or not it's in school or in your careers or wherever you are in life, that you have mentors. Blanche has been a mentor to me from the time period I first started, and I see other mentors in here as well. And so to be at this place at this time and having you say that is just a remarkable thing. This is my 7th book, and people have said, of course, in academia, it's publish or perish, but I've been a tenure professor for a long time. I don't have to publish anything. I write because I'm a writer. And there are writers in this room, and many people have writing in them, but you could write and go in policing. You can write and be a lawyer. You can write and do other things. So I want you to know that this is one of the things I do. I'm also a playwright, as was pointed out. I worked on a documentary film. Just know that you've been given many gifts, and you should explore and use those gifts. And one of the gifts that I like using is the gift of what if. And I remember being in Brooklyn, and I talk about this, and there was an activist, and I didn't know her at all. And she died without any money for a funeral. And she had spent her adult life working in activist causes to make her community better. And at the same time, I'm hearing these people say protest doesn't matter. So I'm thinking, well, what if I wrote a book that argued the case on behalf of protest? So I put my law hat on and said, I'll make a legal argument on behalf of protest. And that would have been a great textbook, interesting to some, but I wanted it to be interesting to many. And so I decided to do something I've not ever done before, which was to actually use memoir, which is scary, to put some of my personal life into a book. And also for those people who are the academics in the room, and there are many, that's one thing you're not supposed to do. You're always supposed to have this wall between you and the subject matter. So, but I decided to break through this wall and actually bring in my great-great-grandmother, who was born enslaved in Kentucky, and her protests that she did during slavery. I started to expand the idea of protest beyond what we do in the streets, to say, what about protests when we look at Rosa Parks? She refused to give up her seat. Isn't that protest? What about the ways in which we can decide not to buy some places or to spend our money in other places? The organizations we may join. There are many ways in which we can protest. The sit-in is a protest. Voicing yourself loudly is a protest. Standing with your fist in the air and saying nothing is a protest. We have to be creative when it comes to social justice and protest. And so I started looking at the indigenous, and this is Indigenous History Month, and I was thinking about their protests. Europeans come to this land in 1607, and they're in Virginia. That's the beginning of our country, not the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims, that is not the beginning of our country. Our country begins in 1607 with the arrival of the English into Virginia. And so the initial reception is, oh, you need some food, you need a little time, fine. You're eating all our food and you're taking too much time, go. And the English won't go. So now the indigenous have to use various forms of protest. And so when you start thinking about slave uprisings can be protests. Here's one right over here, yeah. Slave uprisings could be protests. So if you're running away from slavery, there could be protests. So I just started looking at the ways in which protest has been used over centuries of time, and then trying to get people to see, especially young people, the various ways in which you can participate in social movements.
That's great. I love your sections on the Bradshaws.
That's my family, my mother's side.
Yes. How do you pronounce your mother's name?
Ardith.
Ardith. You write so powerfully about all of them. Tell us a little bit more about your mother.
Now you're going to make me, because I can get a little weepy when I talk about my mother.
Well, she wanted to be a concert pianist.
And Juilliard is just up the street. She wanted to go to Juilliard, and they didn't let her in because they were very racist at the time.
And sexist.
And yes, and sexist about women. And so one of the things that I did, I applied to Juilliard. I applied to Juilliard 3 times to be a playwright. I didn't get in either. So, one of the things that I try to look at is keeping a hold of your dream is protest. Holding on to your dream is protest. So someone says no here, hold on to your dream somewhere else. Protest against the fact that people want to put you in a box and keep you there. That they might not recognize the skills that you have, the beauty in your heart. They might not see what you have to offer the world. Hold on to that as a protest against them deciding that you're lesser than. So speaking of my mother, I'll read a section of the book again. My mother lay dying. Her youthful dreams of a career as a classical pianist had passed away 70 years earlier and were quietly buried beneath the piano she kept but rarely played. Even in her frail and dependent state, Ardith Bradshaw, who enjoyed the title Lady Bradshaw, had a haughty bearing that irritated white medical staff and bemused people of color. She had grown up on the plains of Kansas, a farmer's daughter who detested farm work and had shown such a strong interest in playing the piano that her father, Levi Bradshaw, my grandfather, purchased an upright piano along with the services of a white musical tutor.
That's great. It's great.
One of the things my grandfather, who was a farmer, but he was a teacher, and they closed the black schools, so he had to go back into farm work. So when I start thinking about the people in my family who have been teachers, and then it was in writing this book that I realized that I'm part of a line of teachers without even knowing it.
Well, that's the other thing. They all went to college. They went to Spelman. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, great-great-grandmother Eliza, back in the time period of slavery, you had no rights of your own. No, you weren't even a human being. You had to do everybody's work from before the sun rose till after the sun set. And one thing you were to never do, you were to never say no, you were to never defend yourself from a beating, and you were to never sit down in the presence of white people. So one day, my great-great-grandmother Eliza was very tired, taking care of the cooking and the cleaning and the kids and everything else for this other person. She didn't know that the slave mistress, whose last name was Christian, we'll leave that out there. Okay, and so Harriet and Thomas Christian, and so she sat down for a moment, and Harriet Christian came up behind her with a big stick and cracked her over the back of the head, and blood is everywhere. And then she held my great-great-grandmother Eliza down on the floor and poured salt into the wound and said, "How dare you be so lazy? And then when my husband gets home, you're really going to get it." And so that night, as they're eating dinner, Harriet and Thomas Christian, they're discussing the fact that now Eliza needs to be horsewhipped. And they kept a horsewhip above the door in the kitchen, and it was there as a warning. If you ever did anything we didn't like, you would be brutally beaten. And so after they finished their dinner, Thomas Christian goes into the kitchen and he reaches his arm up. He's about to put his hand on the horsewhip, but he doesn't understand that Eliza's been boiling mad this entire time. And she's also been boiling a big pot of water. And by this time, that water is boiling, and she picks up scoops of it with a pot, and she throws it on Thomas Christian, who begins to scream and holler. And then, of course, Harriet runs in and wants to know what's it. She starts throwing it on her, too. So they're all scalded with third-degree burns. But they never hit her again. And she lived her life, not ever being touched. And they called her Crazy Eliza. And he's like, "Well, you can call me Crazy Eliza. Don't put your fingers on me again." And they didn't. She lived the rest of her life enslaved, though. And when she was finally free, she and others built a school. They built a school, and then the Ku Klux Klan came and burned it down. And this was in Kentucky. And so they said, "We're done. We're not going to do any more. We're going to go up north." So they left in 1879, and they went to Kansas and started their farm there. And they had just gotten there, and it was a terrible drought. And Eliza's husband died the first year. So here she is, all the way up in another part of the country, and her husband's gone. Survival can be protest.
Survival is the best revenge, said Audre Lorde.
So think about that. Think about survival as protest for people who want to take you under. She survived, and her granddaughter went to school and graduated in 1907 as a teacher in Kansas. She wrote an essay about Eliza. That essay was published in the school newspaper. That essay was found in 2002 by a professor at that same college. And that essay then became a part of an article he wrote. But there was also the great cousin. I don't know what he was, like great cousin, great cousin. Where the cousins fit in? But it's like we had two in my family who went to Spelman in 1920. The Red Summer is 1919. They traveled from Kansas, from the farmlands of Kansas, where our family was now, associated with Kansas and farming, down to Georgia to go to Spelman College. Georgia had the highest lynching rate next to Mississippi. And these women went there by themselves. Took the train all the way. Why? To go to school. Because they wanted an education. So they didn't want to just be a farmer's wife. They wanted to actually be teachers. And so they made that sacrifice to go all the way there to be a teacher. And then they became teachers, and they said, well, if you get married, you can't teach anymore. You have to stay home. So they did another protest thing. They lied and never told them they got married. And they continued to teach. But those are some of the people who were that. But I think all of us, yes, but all of us have that. If you start thinking about your family line, you're going to come up with relatives. You're going to come up with people. You didn't get in this room by yourself. There are all different types of relatives in your family line, just like Eliza, just like Maddie, just like all of these Cora and the rest of the relatives I've talked to you about, who decided that they were going to protest in their own way in order for you to be here today.
You know, it's hard not to talk about this moment in which we need to be in protest on a regular basis, and so much is going on. And this book deals with all of what is going on. So what are your words of advice for this moment?
We have to recognize that we're in a battle. I had an opportunity to talk with my cousin who lives in Nashville. Like many members of our family are now spread out from the Midwest, like I'm here in New York. And she said, but I don't understand. If people do something to you, what if you don't do anything back? Won't they just leave you alone? Have you found that to be the case?
No.
So this is now the situation, you know, and I'm tired of being in the group that I feel like I'm the kid on the playground who's getting my lunch money taken every afternoon. You know, I feel like I want to be on a team where people are actually doing something. You have a button, peace demands action. And so you can decide how you want to participate. You know, the other thing, excellence becomes protest. Excellence can be protest. When you are tired, when it's rainy, when it's cold, when you don't want to do your homework, when you don't want to participate in anything, that's when you have to call on the ancestors. You have to call on the people who came before you and say, okay, I don't have the strength to do this in my own right, but I got here based on what other people did. So let me just think about what they went through for me to get here. So the advice would be, if you can't do it in your own right, in your own mind, in your own strength, call on the strength and the right in your mind of the people you know who came before you, who invested for you to be here. And you'd be surprised. I also like to have people to interview their grandparents. And if you ask your grandparents what they were doing at your age, you will find the difference in what you're able to do now and what they were able to do back then. And you'll see that arc of time.
When you went through this book, first of all, how long did it take you to write this book?
Too long.
How long? All of my books take me 10 years.
Yeah, it took about 10
takes.
years. And then you know, but Beacon Press was a wonderful press. I had to restructure it 3 times. In the meantime, for those of you who are following the Marvel universe, I have a short story in Marvel where I came up with my own character. So I also do fiction as well.
Who is the Marvel character?
The Marvel Chaos.
Oh.
I call her Chaos. Her name is Charlotte Olivia, but when she gets angry, you have chaos. Okay, so. Cool. But anyway, I gave all my rights away, so we won't even talk about it. Anyway, but the other part of it is that when I'm writing this book, I'm also working on other things, and I didn't write this book in January when all of these things happened. But what's so interesting about it, the people who were talking about protests didn't matter. I think little by little, they're starting to see that it does matter. And there are people saying, well, we don't have the Supreme Court. We don't have Congress. We don't have the White House. I will say for most of this country's history, when it comes to people of color, when it comes to women, immigrants, we never had the White House and the Congress and the Supreme Court on our side. For most of American history, we didn't have those three. What we did have was protest. And so we just think about those rights I talked about from 1791 in the First Amendment. We had freedom of speech. Protests made that law a reality. So you could have the laws on the books, but do you actually have the reality in your life? And that's where protest comes in.
When you were doing this research, who are some of your favorite protesters?
I will say, and some of the protesters that have been forgotten.
Yeah.
So people speak of George Floyd now. I can say George Floyd and 99.9% of the people know. But there were other protesters.
Like Pauli Murray.
Yes, like Pauli Murray, like John Brown. So then you get into that people are, get kind of nervous between violent and nonviolent protests. That becomes a question. It's like, well, if our protests all supposed to be nonviolent, and how do you look at protests and violence and urban uprisings? And urban uprisings have taken place, and many times during the country's history, when it comes to people believing that, the urban uprisings came around the George Floyd's, murder, so there have been urban uprisings. But John Brown was a white minister from upstate New York who in 1859 decided that he was going to go to Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and stage an uprising against slavery. So if you have a chance to learn more about John Brown, that would be someone to think about. Tom Hayden. And Tom Hayden was the college student at University of Michigan who put together one of the largest anti-war protests in American history. And he also started the Teach-In. I don't know if he started, but he really made it very famous. And the Teach-In, so groups like this, or even smaller groups, your friends would sit around. So during this book tour that I'm on, I have been to, as was pointed out by Dr. Carpy, over 20 states. So I've been in New Mexico and Colorado, down to Texas. I just came back from Florida last night. And so talking to different people this is like a teach-in, trying to get people to see what the issues are. And the issues come down to democracy. That's what the concern is. Where is our democracy? And do we actually have three branches of government working the way they're supposed to work? When we have someone who's legislating from the White House, with now, I think it was at over 150, might even be more, executive orders, that basically those executive orders, that's what the legislative branch is supposed to be doing. And so those are some of the concerns that people are protesting about. Authoritarianism, the fact that we don't have a king. It actually says in the Constitution that we're not supposed to have any royal titles. That's why we don't have them. It's in the Constitution. We are not allowed to have any royal titles. Because once we had a king and they said we don't want a king anymore and no one is going to be a king. And so I think those are some of the issues that we have that people are protesting about. They're protesting about people in a mask. There are people in this room who want to go in law enforcement. But wearing a mask, nobody sees your name, no badge, that's not the way our law enforcement works or was working before this year. So those are the things people are protesting about as well. If someone, and I have a friend of mine who was walking on the street in Washington, D.C., and a car pulls up and snatches these three men off who looked like they were Spanish speaking and put them in a car and drove away. They didn't, tell them their rights. They didn't say why they were being picked up, nothing. Just picked them up, threw them in the car and drove away. And they had masks on, and baseball caps. That's not a democracy. That is not supposed to be happening in a democracy. So
It's fascism.
that's why to learn more about the issues so that you know why you're protesting in the first place. Those are people who, different people have different reasons for protesting, and there are different ways to protest. But one of the important points is, when you're putting a protest together, do people understand what you're protesting? Why you're protesting? So one of the things you might think about doing in this old-fashioned is to actually have a list of what your demands are. Have a list of what your protest issues are, so that people know what you're protesting, because everyone is not going to be at the protest who understands what's going on. There are going to be people who are walking down the sidewalk watching your protest, and they're going to have to figure out what you're doing and why you're doing it. And so you have to explain to other people, and that's where the teach-in comes in, so people can be in a position where they can explain why they're protesting in the first place.
So back to, besides Tom Hayden.
Daisy Bates.
Okay.
Oh, so Daisy Bates was very stylish. And and she was just this very sophisticated, even though she really had nothing more than a high school education. But she was a very sophisticated person. She found out that her mother had been killed by a gang. And instead of getting angry and being depressed and letting that anger eat her up, she took that anger and she used it as fuel. And that's something that I like, and that's something I respect, and it's something I do. I had someone ask me the other day, it was like, oh, you've written, 7 produced plays, and this is your 7th book, and this is my 4th or 5th film. It's like, how do you have time to do all this? What motivates you? Rage. Rage motivates me. Rage is my fuel. And if you can take your rage and use it as fuel to move yourself to another place and not make it heavy on your heart that you become this bitter person. I don't want to be a bitter person. I want to be a loving person. I want to stay a caring person. I want to have friends. I want to have relationships. But if you let the hate stay inside and all of that, I don't hate. I don't spend my time hating. If you hate, you give away your power. And power is a tremendous thing. And so I try to use the rage I have for the discrimination, for the unfairness, for the things I see, and put it in constructive places, like writing books, like writing plays. And when it gets to be too much, and for those of you who might have taken my race in the law class, when it gets to be too much, then I go out and I want to see something life-affirming. I want to go watch children play and be in a position in which I can enjoy my life. That's important. But if you have this heaviness, if you try to hate, you can't win that way. So I try to use those types of negative things and try to turn it around and see what I can do that's positive.
That's great. There's two questions. Did you know Audre Lorde?
I did not know Audre Lorde, but I do know the Audre Lorde phrase that your silence will not protect you.
Your silence will not protect
Your silence will not protect you, especially in an authoritarian state. You can't appease a dictator. And I had the opportunity to watch Winston Churchill in this film, and he was dealing with Hitler. And I'm not saying this guy is Hitler. I'm not saying that.
Well, the only book he says he's ever read is Mein Kampf.
Yes.
So he wants to be Hitler.
Well,
Yeah.
let's just put it this way. At the end of the day, whether or not it's this regime, and I call it a regime because he's called himself a dictator, if it's this regime or it's something else, there are many things that we've protested over the years. Women's rights we've protested, civil rights we've protested, voting rights we've protested. There are so many different things that we protested over time. We need to understand that as we protest, we have to be able to interact with other people and listen to their side. And I'm talking about other people want to join your protest or not. How are we supposed to go forward if you're protesting only against something? What are you protesting for? What vision do you have for the world? What do you want out of things? So I think that's very important to understand, that just being against something is not enough. You actually have to also be for something.
I have so many things that I've noticed. Read this, read that, pages and pages and pages. But one question I have, you refer to yourself as a widow yourself?
Yes, because, I am a widow. I mean, I lost my husband in 2016, and that's why I know survival is protest. Because, when you lose your partner, you've got to recreate yourself. And I have some outstanding role models who are activists, and you're, of course, one of them. But one of my role models says you either get up or you sit down. And if you sit down and you stay seated, you're going to find yourself seated years later. And I found that to be true. Those people who decided I'm going to give up and just sit down are still seated. They never got together, never got back up. And some of you might have relatives. And you remember them, it's like they lost somebody or something happened, they felt defeated, they sat down, and they never got back up into the game. It's so important that when you face obstacles that seem they've turned the world upside down, you've got to figure out how to go forward. Because going forward in the face of devastating loss is protest. It's a way to protest on behalf of life and be life-affirming.
You have a section called Don't Give Up, and you refer to Christian Nunez, who is the youngest president of now.
Yes,
in Arizona.
The National Association of Women. This is what really gets me when she was saying don't give up. Sometimes it can look pretty, dispiriting, but then look at the diversity in this room. Just take the time to look at the diversity in this room. This didn't happen by accident. It didn't happen by accident. People protested to have this happen. So when you think of education, the City University of New York was something that was created for us. If you take out the City University of New York, what do you have? NYU and Columbia.
And I just want to say,
isn't that something?
Yes.
Think about that. You have NYU and Columbia. So the City University of New York was something that was created for us to have. And that's why I take advantage of everything that's here. People had to protest to create a college for regular people, not just the wealthy. And that's why what's going on right now with this focus on just money. And I'm not against money. I like money. Money can be my friend. We can have a really deep relationship. Okay, but greed is another story. That's another story. And you can't I won't say you can't. I think it's difficult to have an identity based on being a millionaire. And if you're not a millionaire, you're nothing. And that's what's happening. If we're not millionaires, then what are we supposed to be? Just the labor class for millionaires?
Enslaved, thieves.
So serfs to the millionaires. That's why I want you to think about what's happening right now, is that they want to create a perpetual labor class. That's why they're cutting out so many ladders into the middle class, so that people will stay a labor class and will be the laborers to the millionaires, which is the way it used to be in my labor chapter, which is the way it used to be in the 1800s. That's how it was. You might think it was different, but that's how it was in the 1800s, into the early 1900s. Until we started having labor unions, we were the labor class, and we were supposed to just work at the very bottom always and never rise up. And if one was an immigrant, it was fine to be an immigrant as long as you didn't have any baby immigrants, because what are those baby immigrants called? Citizens. And what does a citizen have?
Rights.
Rights. And especially the right to vote.
Ooh.
I want you.
Mamdani might get elected.
Yes,
Whoa.
you might elect somebody who's not the wealthy class, or better yet, you have the choice of whom you're going to elect, who's going to be your voice. So that's why I'm saying, when you start looking at history and the history of protest, you start to see how regular people had to use protest to get their rights on the agenda, to have their issues on the table. And they had to do that by coming together, which means we have to better understand each other. We have to better understand how and why we should come together. Because if we're individualized, we're going to see it's very difficult. And I'll give this one last example. In 2022, I had the opportunity to be a fellow at Harvard. So it was really great, and I had a chance to actually teach a class at Harvard, and I was one of the first fellows in the Institute of Politics at the Kennedy School to actually teach as well. But Harvard has stood up for many, many years against, it feels like many years, many months, against this regime. Harvard has more money in its endowment than any other school on the planet. It cannot stand up against the federal government by itself. You cannot. It's going to have to join with other schools. It's going to have to unify with others. So if Harvard can't stand up against this regime, how do we individually think we can? We have to stand together. We're stronger together.
The union makes us free. The PSC forever. Let me just say a word. There were efforts to close City University many times. Republicans came into power, people like Giuliani and other people, and they said, let's just close the City University, all the colleges. And we had a member of the Board of Higher Education, Julius C.C. Edelstein. Julius Caesar Catullus Edelstein was his name. And for some reason, he wanted me to work with him and be his editor, and I was happy to do that. And when they were going to close the City University, he said, what do we do now? And I said, we march. And we marched, and we had the biggest march ever across the city. And they didn't close the City University. It was one of the really, so we've got to be activists, and we've got to have allies, and we need each other. And there are allies in surprising places.
Yes.
Like Julius was, was he commissioner of education?
He was vice chancellor.
Vice chancellor. He was vice chancellor. But he was our ally, and we have allies in funny places. And we just need to keep building alliances and be activist on every level.
Yes. And we are going to get to your questions as well, and I hope that you have some, and that you're thinking about ways in which protest is an issue that you want to know more about.
I want to ask you one more question.
Mm-hmm.
CCR, Peter Weiss died yesterday, and there's Center for Constitutional Rights, and the ACLU, which Crystal Eastman founded during World War I, and I'm curious, do you do any work with CCR or ACLU?
I have a radio show called Law of the Land. That's another part of civic engagement that I do. And so I've had members of the ACLU on. I'm going to be speaking with, on a platform with the ACLU in January. I also think it's important that we know the ACLU is the American Civil Liberties Union. So the ACLU is an organization, and there's like the NAACP. You hear these acronyms, and sometimes you don't know what they actually mean, what they do, how long they've been around, but they have been doing social justice work for decades. Yes, at least a century. Well, and so it's important for us to know that these nonprofit organizations are out there in case, and this is something, the ACLU actually has on its website what to do if you want to protest. So you can go on that website and look at some of the things that you should do if you're thinking about protesting. I always like to tell people these basic things. Don't, and especially for young people, don't protest after dark. Don't protest after dark. That's when bad things happen. So I actually, and I've led protests, and so when I'm leading a protest, I try to find out what time of day the sun goes down. Like, I actually look it up so I know what time, and I make sure that my people are out of there at least an hour before. I want people to understand that if there is any type of situation in which you feel uncertain, you should just leave. You need to know if somebody's leading a protest. Who's leading your protest? Who are they? Do you know them? Are you familiar? When it's nighttime, other people can come and infiltrate your protest and you don't know what they're doing, and they can then get you in some big trouble. Also, two other things. For those people who are grown, you can always have the bond money. I always say to my friends when I'm about to do something, who's got the bond money? Because you're gonna have to get out. So somebody needs to have some cash. Yes. So you can always put together a fund, to have the bond money. There are ways in which, that's why I say there are ways in which you can participate in the protest without physically being at the protest. You need lawyers. You don't have to be a protest lawyer, just be the lawyer who can make that call to get the person out. And if you're going to call, where's the telephone number? I say, as other people have said too, use a marker and put the telephone number somewhere on your skin or on your clothes. They're going to take your cell phone. If all those major numbers are in your phone, you won't have your phone. So put that telephone number on the sleeve of your clothes or put it on marker on your skin so that you have it and you can make those calls when you need to make those calls. Have somebody there to get the call. Whom are you calling? If the person who's there to get the call is in the protest, that's a bad idea. If they're in a cell next to yours, that's not good. So people have to stay home. Some people have to not be there. So they can be the one with the money, they can be the one with the lawyer's number, they can be the one to come to pick you up or come to get you. So there are different things you can do to safeguard yourself, but always know when especially with social media, when they say, oh, flash protests, who's doing the flash protests? I know it's exciting to be a part of a protest, but you have to know who is in that leadership position. And for those of you who are leaders in protests or want to be leaders in protests, it's a big responsibility, but there's always somebody else who has the skill of community organizing. Somebody else has the song. You need to come up with some songs. And I told you I was in third grade when I was my first protest. I came up with my little song, and I sang it to somebody the other day, and they were like, I'm glad you weren't the one that keeps doing the songs for the protest. But, just think about the different ways in which you can be a part. And the other is called selective buying. Don't buy where you're not respected. Don't spend your money where you're not respected. So that's a simple protest. It might mean you go 2 blocks further to get that lottery ticket or that hot dog or that hamburger or that Coke or wherever you want to get, but it's worth it for your own self-esteem. So those are the things that I would say. I want to just, if you don't mind, if I end with this.
Please.
Page 291. Obstacles may shift and forces form to seemingly block the sun, but history shows that while these obstacles may be formidable, they are not intractable. Progress will continue as long as voices rise and people stand shoulder to shoulder as part of a cause bigger than themselves, using creativity and tenacity, envisioning the change they wish to have, and then pushing for it. Faith is protest. Hope in one's ability to make the world a better place is protest. Because protest in large and small ways can change the world. Thank you.
So, do we have time? It's 5:30.
We do have time for questions from the audience, so if you want to raise your hands, I will run this mic over to you so you can be heard.
I wanted to ask more about getting involved in protest, how you would, like you mentioned the resources on the ACLU, but I think going further into you did start protesting in third grade, but how did you continue being involved in protest, and how a college student can also start being involved in one?
Okay. They have, Indivisible is one organization that's been holding protests. I was actually just on a panel earlier today on human rights, and you can look at that organization, humanrights.org, for protests. No Kings, so the No Kings Day protests that took place. So nokings.org is a protest site that has different protests around the country. And you could also just form your own protest. You can decide you and say 4 or 5 other people are going to go to Union Square. And if you go to Union Square in Lower Manhattan, there are always protests going on down there, so that you could go there and be a part of the protests that are already there, or you can decide how you want to protest. But just know that when we think about protests in those years, the civil rights protests, the women's protests, anti-war protests, those people actually studied the protests. They were like, how are we going to do this? Where are we going to be? And there are civil, I guess you can look at it, people can be civil in their protests, but they can also, and I'm just going to say this, and I'm not promoting it, but there are ways in which people can protest in which they do things that are not legal. And I'm not saying you should, because this is a school of criminal justice, and I work here. But, civil resistance can take many forms. But you have to know there are consequences. And that's why I mentioned the possibility of arrest, because that can happen with protests. I try to mention the possibility of avoiding harm. I don't feel it's a successful protest unless everybody gets home safely. That's important. But there's also messaging. Some of you might be really good with the message, because if you don't have a message, then you're not convincing or persuading people outside of your protest. You know why you've gathered, but why are other people, people who aren't there, why should they care? And I think that's what got lost with a lot of protests. If you're not speaking in a way that people understand why they should care, not screaming and hollering at them, you're horrible that you're not here, but this is the reason why we think this is important enough for us to go out of our way to do what we're doing. Explain it to people. And that's why I said, hand something to people. Do something that they understand why this is so important. And then they might ask themselves, well, what can I do to help? But they have to know what's going on in the first place. So when you gather, maybe at Union Square, maybe other places, also know that protesting is something that is to get the message across, but you have to have a goal. What is the goal of your protest? In a lot of protests right now, people are just arriving somewhere, they have a sign, and then they leave. What do you want from your protest? I know this is really deep, right? But it's simple. What is it that you really want from your protest? You want to change somebody's mind, right? That's what you should be thinking about. What am I getting out of this? Am I just emoting? I just need to get my feelings out? This is all about my feelings? Or is this about changing, social change? You're changing something for your community. And if you're trying to change something for your community, what is it that you want to change? What is it that you want to do? And that means you've got to have a message that can get to other people. One
to add to that. I always say never go anywhere without your gang. For social change, you need a group.
You need a group.
Gang. And we need to go arm in arm, hand in hand with a crowd. And so develop a gang.
And if you decide you're going to go somewhere, make sure you tell people where you're going. Okay? And go with a group. There are people who feel they can protest by themselves, but they've been doing this for a long time. They're like grown. But you're starting off protesting, you should be in a group. You should go somewhere, as I said, well lighted during the day, and that you tell people where you're going. You have your phone numbers and your information so that, you are protected. This country harms protesters, and I'm sorry to say this, but it's true. It harms protesters. And the same people they're harming in one generation, they're benefiting from the protest in the next generation. That's something that's unusual in some cases, but it's not unusual for this country. The same people who protested King George and said, we're going to have a Declaration of Independence. This will be something great for if you don't say this already. You know that next year is the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Okay, for those of you who didn't know that, you can go to school and tell the people in your classroom, did you know this, Professor? Okay, so 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence is a protest document. So they're protesting King George. We have the Revolutionary War. And then within 15 years, they are deporting people from the country because they're protesting in the country. So this is what happens. So you have people come in, and then they protest for their rights, they get their rights, then somebody else comes in, they say, well, we have rights, we want, oh no, that you've gone too far. This happens all the time. It happens generation after generation. So you have to realize the same people who are going to be trying to stop protests are people who protested for rights that they have. So understanding that this happens in this country and protecting yourself at the same time, because until they realize you're bringing a benefit to the country, you're going to be seen as somebody who is doing something negative and wrong.
Question. Take one more question. And then you sign books.
Okay, good evening. Earlier you referenced infiltrators to the protests. We should be aware that excuse me for a second, J. Edgar Hoover's FBI positioned infiltrators in protest movements to basically eviscerate them. In your research, have you seen where that tactic is still going on?
Well, I believe it's still going on without the research, because the protests around Palestine were very effective until NYPD figured out how to get into the groups. But this is some part of it too. And being called names is part of it. That's part of it. You're going to be called malcontents, un-American, all that. You're going to be called names. I'm going to give you a vocabulary word. You're going to be like, I want you to impress people with this one. Draptomania. Draptomania. Let's say it out loud. Draptomania. Okay, D-R-A-P-E, mania. Okay, so draptomania in 1851. Somebody look it up. What does it say? Who can look it up for me very quickly?
Used to describe a supposed mental disorder that caused enslaved people to run away from there.
Yes. So they were called insane for running away from slavery. So if you start thinking about the names that people could be called, but to say you're in bondage and be called insane because you're leaving, and they have a word for it, and they said the cure is more work and torture. I want you to understand when we're talking about protest, this country is born of protests. We have protests all the time, and yet we have this really fraught relationship with protest. And we benefit from it all the time, but when we're in the process of the protesting, it's like, oh, this is horrible, until we get the benefit. So, oh, yes. And then we wake up every day with the benefit. And I'll give you one quick one. The 8-hour workday. The 8-hour workday was a law that nobody respected. People were being worked 12 and 20 hours a day, until protesters then had to actually protest us to get what we have now. So we need to understand that when we wake up every day with these protests, benefits, that it's something that we had to work for over many, many generations. In the end, as we go, unless there's another quick question, and I'll do something that I don't do very often, is have a short answer.
Sorry. Do you think that, like, the reason why, do you think the reason why there's more now of a negative view of protests is because the way that protests are happening is changing?
Oh, no, it's always been negative. That's why I want you to know.
Fascists are in power.
Yeah, it's always been protesters have always been seen as negative. Even the anti-war protesters were seen as un-American. You know, it was like, oh, how dare you protest the war? The war is good, and you don't care about your country. You should leave. All these things were said about people. When women wanted the right to vote, oh, you don't like men. You know, how dare you want equal rights? You don't deserve it. Women don't have the mind, the ability to think clearly enough to need the vote. You know, when black people wanted to have equal the rights that we're supposed to have, people died, were beaten up. You know, it's how dare you want to vote? We're citizens. How dare you want to vote? So there's always been this issue. Immigrants come into this country all the time. And it's fine if you're working, but as soon as you want to vote, as soon as you want rights, that's when it changes. That's the same thing that happened with the Irish. It happened with the Italians. It happened with all these other groups from Europe that came through all this time. And then too many of them turn around and forget that it happened to them, and they turn around and do the same things to other people. And this is the way it's been going on time and time again. And you just have to realize that protest is power. And as I said, we're in this room all together right now because of the power of protest. Santa Claus did not give you your rights. Okay, I know the holidays are coming up.
Now, let me just say, empowerment is reading this book. So this book is for sale right here, and everybody will be empowered and enhanced by reading this splendid book.
Thank you. And thank all of you for coming. I so appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. Power to the people.
Power to the people. I want you to sign this book for me and Claire.
Okay.
Check, cash money, what?
Oh, my goodness. I didn't even think about that. Do you do like